Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever it is in your part of the world for this presentation. My name is Brother Bill Ross from Chesterland, Ohio, and this study is going to be in 3 parts on the book of Revelation. The first session will be on the terms that are needed to even get into the book and study it. Number 2 will be an overview of the chapters 2 and 3, the 7 churches in Asia, and how they fit into this whole narrative, because they are key to everything that takes place in Revelation. Third class will be cover chapter 10 and chapter 16. There's an overview of those 2 chapters, the items they present, the problems they present, and some possible solutions for those problems. And then I will close, hopefully, with some current information on where we stand in the world. And I hope that will satisfy everybody. So, let's get started. We're looking at the book of Revelation. I know that quite a number of you do daily Bible readings, so quite a number of you have read through this book, if you will, either one or numerous times over the years. The problem is when we look at Revelation, it does not read the same as the rest of our Bible does. So it is a book to be studied and not just read. One of the first things you have to ask yourself when you're looking at reading this book, what version of the Bible are you using? Because every version has some differences to it, even though theoretically they were all translated from the Vatican Codex 1016. There are still translation errors or translation to people who are have a bias on certain items. So we'll try and go through some of those as we get into this presentation. Context and flow. The context and flow of Revelation is everything. And what I mean by that is, if you are going to study the book, the first thing we need to do, or you need to do, is to sit down and do a study of reading through and then picking out all of the items that basically you need to understand. Now, I can give you some help in that area because as I've been going through, I have been putting together various lists of things that in each of the chapters is vital to understanding the book. Let's give some examples. If you will, we have quite a number of items, and we can start with angels. How many angels do you find when you read through the book of Revelation? Are they the same angel? Are they different angels? Are they groups of angels? And what is their function in each of the books, or each of the chapters within the book? Because what we have is we have a book that is very complex in its structure. Remember, the book was written to the believers in those 7 churches. At that time, they were under great persecution in the years early 90 to 96 AD. So John was on the Isle of Patmos because of his beliefs. He was banished there. So take that into consideration when you're looking at this book, because it's written not only at a time of great persecution, but to get the message across to the people within the 7 churches and eventually to us. You have to understand that it is not written as a normal lesson would be that's given on Sunday morning. So did this, so-and-so did that, so-and-so did this, and you come to a conclusion. No, the way the book is laid out, the chapters and verses sometimes are of no help at all to us because they stop in the middle, or they should have been broken up into smaller bits and pieces for us to follow what the narrative is that's being presented. We're also covering, if you will, over 1900 years of prophecy in this book. the prophecy that's been given to us by John, from Christ, from God. So we have to look at the book and we have to start tearing it apart, if you will, piece by piece, to come up with all of these terms that are in there that we need as believers to understand before we can really understand this book. And in some cases, as my wife says, why is it so confusing? Well, I can't really answer that question because John didn't give me a good answer on it. But I can surmise, if you will, after study over several years and looking at the book, it is written to believers, not to the outside world. If we are cognizant of history, oops, we have a problem here. Most people don't like history. If you don't like history, the book is going to be more difficult than usual. Problem is quite a bit of this is history. If we go to the 7 churches in Asia and talk about them, it's all history. Where were they there? How long did they last? What were their missions? And if we don't study those, you can't find out what's really going on in the rest of the book. So my key is chapters 2 and 3 really lay the basis and groundwork for studying Revelation. As an example, let me give you a few items that we need to start considering. If you will, where was John when the book was written? That gives us a clue as to how close he was or how far away he was from the churches that he was actually going to talk to or was directed to talk to. We need the where he is, the why was he there, and at what time frame was he there. Now, depending over the years, and believe me, I've attended or listened to many sessions with many brothers presenting on various aspects of this book. I'm telling you, from my perspective, if you do not understand history and you do not want to study it, don't bother to get into the book because it will not make sense to you. History is everything for this book. Let's take one particular item, if you will. In the very first part of the book we have beast. Now what is a beast? Well, we have to study the beast because there are a lot of references to beast in the book. If we take beast alone, I can't say that beast number 1 and beast number 4 are the same beast. It may be an iteration of that beast or a follow-through from one particular piece of history to another that it represents, or it may be something totally different. Now, let me give you an example, and this is where the translation comes in for a lot of this. The beast in chapter 4 are rendered beast in some versions, and then I've got about 15 versions that reference it as living creatures, not beast. So what are they? Are they beast or are they living creatures? Now, it makes a big difference because, once again, the context is where are these beasts or living creatures speaking from? And what are they doing? If you don't research that, you read over it and it sounds very good and you just go on and you've lost the whole context. Because if you read beast, think of beast. Think of your dog. Think of any beast. What does it do? It'll bark. It'll croak if it's a frog. It'll do something else, meow if it's a pussycat. But when I look at living creatures versus beast in chapter 4, there's something that stands out. They are praising God. So they're not a normal beast, if you would, if you're going to use that term. So we have to be careful of the terms. Just because it was written in the book does not mean that we need to just read over it and take it for granted that that's what it is. We need to dig into each of these and find out what they are. So beast is an area of study that will take you several hours to accomplish, if you will. If we move on, we have dragons. And believe me, I've been in enough discussions about dragons that there's another whole area of study, if you will. What is a dragon? What is a dragon in Revelation? What does that dragon do in different periods of time? What is he involved in? And what does he represent? So you have to get into each of those. Number 3, same category, angels. We have multiple references to angels in the book of Revelation. They are not all the same angels. Everyone that's given, in most cases, they have a specific duty to do. They may be waiting at the river Euphrates. They could be doing something else. They could be delivering woes. They could be delivering sounds of trumpets. Each one has to be researched, analyzed, so you can put it into the proper perspective when you run across it within the readings in the book. Seals, trumpets, we have 7 of each of those. What are they? What did they involve? What parts of the world did they involve? Another item that we, as a sideline, let's take another item that we have to be familiar with. Not just history, now I have to be into geography. Where are these places in the world? Because I'm dealing from John's time with the Roman Empire. If I'm thinking of the Roman Empire, I have to start from basically, let's go back and we can start with Jesus' birth and what was going on in the Roman Empire. But we're not concerned that far back. We're concerned from John's time and what was going on from his time and what was going to take place into the future. So I have not only history, but I have now geography. Because where's the Roman Empire? It's not just in Italy. It covers all of Southern Europe. It covers a good part of the Middle East and all of North Africa, north of the Sahara Desert. A huge empire, if you will. Now, it is evolving over time from its original to John's time, and John's time well into the future. So we have to consider each of these periods of history, and we'll get into that a little bit more on the next session. We have 7 trumpets that are presented. Well, we know that trumpets give a blast sound, but we have to get in. What are each of those 7 trumpets? What is going on? What is being imparted to us? If we don't study it, we won't know. And this is where chapters and verses, once again, sometimes are not helpful in your study because they break somewhere in between and reduce the content and the flow of what is going on. Get into that maybe a little bit in the 3rd session with a couple of the chapters, which I'll try and point out. We have witnesses that we have to take into consideration. What are they doing? Some cases we have 2 witnesses. Where are they operating? What are they doing? What are they witnessing? If we don't know, it's hard to understand the book one more time. So we have to take each of these and start going through them. We have something called 7 bowls of wrath. Okay, another area, totally different area of study. We have 7 dooms that we have to take into consideration. And then we have another item that's thrown in called Babylon. Okay, here's another whole study because we're referencing all the way back to the kingdom of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar and bringing it all the way forward to John's time and then projecting its operations, if you will, into the future right down to our time. What do I mean by that? Think of this. What was Babylon? It was the mother of harlots, if you will. It was sin, and sin in the form of idolatry in all of its various formats. And it has carried through from Babylon, Medo-Persia, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, and into the Christian Roman Empire. Those are areas of study that you need to get into and study, because if you don't understand these flow of information through history, you can't understand what's going on in certain parts of the book. We have crowns in many places in the book. You have to understand what a crown is, because a crown is not necessarily a crown in different places. A crown can be for a king or a potentate, or it can be a crown for a sport event that you have won the title prize of, whether it's running, jumping, fighting, whatever. All of these things enter into what is this crown about. We have other things like swords. We have many swords that are mentioned in the book in many different places. What is that sword? Where does it come from? Is it a long sword? A short sword? What is that kind of sword used for? And in the context, you need to understand what kind of a sword you're talking about, or it doesn't really give you the deep meaning of what that verse is trying to tell you. So you have to sit down, and this is a long and painstaking operation, and start going through all of the items that are out there mentioning sword. Whether it's a long sword, short sword, everything is different about a sword. Believe me, you can study it and learn more than you ever wanted to know in the world about a lot of this stuff. We have lamps burning. We have 7 lamps burning. You have to know what they are. Another area of study. Heaven is mentioned quite a number of times. What heaven are we talking about? Are we talking about the heavens that are where men rule, or heavens where the ecclesiastical class rules, that is, church fathers and church people rule? Or are we talking about God's heaven? Each one has to be defined, and you have to know what it is you're reading. Because sometimes we have a tendency to read into things that are not, if you will, what they seem to be. So we have to take it and move forward with it and look at each aspect of every verse. We have areas that are mentioned as who is dwelling in heaven. Another area of operation that you need to kind of define to understand those verses that are related to that. And then we get to the famous, we've got 7 heads, 7 eyes, 7 spirits of God that are sent forth into the earth. Each of those have to kind of be studied. Where do the 7 heads come from? What do they represent? How do they change over periods of time? Remember, we're talking a lot of years here, especially from the years, if you will, pure paganism from 96 AD, roughly when John wrote Revelation, to about 325. We have huge changes taking place within the Roman Empire. Let's talk about waters for a minute. There are a number of references to not just waters, if you will, and seas, fountains of waters, rivers of waters, and now we're into a big look at geography and what do all of these terms mean? What do they apply to? In some cases they might apply to people, but then they also apply, if you will, to certain areas of operations that are going to take place within the book in Europe. Fountains of waters. Where would they come from? What is represented? Well, let's take a quick idea and a quick look from a geography standpoint, if you will. And I'm not going to present any maps or anything. You can go and look at your own. You've got plenty in your Bible, the back of your Bibles to look at. Where are the fountains of water in Europe? The Alps. That's where the snow is. That's where the rivers start. The Rhine, the Po, the Danube, and a number of others. But just off the top of my head, those come to mind first. So all of those rivers also defined, if you will, the frontiers of the Roman Empire to begin with. Beyond those were tribes of people, many tribes of people, that we have to get into. But let's back up for a moment. These rivers, they were natural boundaries, but then they became, if you will, areas of operations for armies. They became symbols, if you will, of things that were going to take place or where they were going to take place. And if you were attending my class at this point, we would have a nice large map of Europe so we could point out where all of these areas are. Because areas today that we have in Europe did not exist in the time of the Roman Empire by name. By area, yes, they still exist. But what we call Serbia and other areas in southeastern Europe today, those names did not exist in 96 AD. So we have to look at all of the aspects of geography to know where these operations are taking place. In addition, what do the rivers mean? They mean the areas of operation, and let me get into one item. We have a number of tribes that are going to be referenced by what was going to take place in history during the operation of Revelation, to give us guidance that God is always working to correct man's falling away from his word. Come out of me, come out of the false church, come back to God. So that's what we're looking at in all of this. God working to punish those who keep falling away, just as Israel did. And guess what? When Israel fell away, they got taken out of their land. Guess what happens to man when he fails God? He gets not necessarily taken out of his land, but he gets, if you will, to the point that God takes him out of the land through different operations. Now, let me cover one item that I like to get into, if you will. We have all of these tribes, and there's another listing there of a great many of them that operate against the Roman Empire, against various aspects of the Roman Empire. Most of these take place after the year 350. Now, why is that significant? Well, remember, before 325, 313 to 325, the Roman Empire was totally pagan from the standpoint of the ruling class. After 325, we have the introduction and the change from paganism to Christianity. Another area of study, because did we get Christianity or did we get something else? If we take a look, we did not get Christianity. We got, if you will, we got an Orthodox church in the East and a Catholic church in the West. If we look at those two churches that came out of the change, roughly 325, they were both pagan. Their concepts were pagan, their beliefs were pagan, and everything that they taught came straight from paganism. They just exchanged, if you will, Christ for other gods. So what we have to do is we have to start separating that out. Because guess what? We have to study, if you will, a little bit about the Emperor Constantine. Oh, he was a great emperor. He gave the empire Christianity. No, he didn't. He was a pagan. He worshipped the sun god, S-U-N. And at the Council of Nicaea in 325, when it came to defining Christ, what did he define him as? Not the S-O-N of God, but the S-U-N. There is a great distinction there because he still kept the sun god as his primary god and passed that on into the church teachings, if you will. So we have to follow through and go through all of these various aspects of what is going on to understand, once again, all of these little nuances of the Roman Empire. Later on, the Roman Empire is going to be chastised for its continued use of paganism instead of Christianity, and God will inflict various punishments. Now, where do these punishments come from? They're going to come from barbarian tribes. Oh. Okay. Let's take the barbarian tribes. I've got a whole list of them. But they're running throughout. But let me give you an idea today, because everybody seems to be into ancestry today. And I had a friend of mine that his wife got into the ancestry thing, and she sent her DNA off to be analyzed, and it comes back, and she's from Eastern Europe, but she was really proud of this. She's got 2% Neanderthal blood background. Now ask yourself, Eastern Europe is a very, very large area. There were probably 80 different tribes there, and they can't tell you what tribes that you are derived from. Or in Western Europe, if you will, my ancestors came from Wales and Scotland and a few other places, most likely. What were they? Ask yourself. They can't tell you. Only God can tell you. Because those invasions over the years, if you will, changed the whole complex of people. We don't call the people in France Gauls anymore. We call them French, because they were Franks that invaded the land and took over. Okay, they were a Germanic tribe. They were not a French tribe, if you will. That was a later derivative and a later understanding. So when you send your DNA off to be analyzed and you think you're doing something, you've wasted your money for the most part, because they are not going to tell you anything about your ancestry other than maybe 1 or 2 generations back. Let's continue on a little bit. Why is history important? Well, if we have no history in Scripture and don't bring it in, we have no plan of salvation. It's very difficult to carry through without having history, because if we don't have the history of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the Exodus, all of that, we have no plan of salvation. We're like the pagans. So we have to study these things in this book to get a hard understanding of where we're going with each and every verse in the book. Then we have to take a look Christianity in the Roman Empire. if you will. Yes, false Christianity made inroads. True Christianity made inroads in the empire. In fact, in a lot of places, true Christianity may have penetrated north of the borders and south of the borders of the Roman Empire into the barbarian tribes. Because when they invaded the empire, one of the items that they held was they did not hold to a triune God. They were converted later on. It's amazing what a little bit of money will do. And when you're invading and pillaging and looking for loot, you can soon have your mind changed as about what you really believe. So we have to look at each period of history, who was doing the invading and who actually ended up being in charge. The invading tribes, for the most part, left no real government operations in charge for any period of time. So we have to look at each of those, because in each case, each chapter, there's something different. We have the tribes that invaded in the west, Roman Empire of the West. We had tribes that invaded in the Roman Empire of the East. Where is the Roman Empire of the East? Well, in 325, roughly, Constantine moved the seat of the empire from Rome 1,400 miles east to Constantinople. Today, for those of you challenged, it's Istanbul, Turkey. But it is still in Europe. Okay? So we have to look at that and see, oh, the empire changed. Western Empire came to its end in about 476 AD. Empire in the West continued for another 1,000 years to 1453. But then, let's come back to the West again. Now we have something called the Holy Roman Empire that operated from about 800 AD to about 1800 AD. So we have to look at that aspect of another version, if you will, iteration of the Roman Empire and its influence today. Now, going back, one of the things that everybody asks me, I'll say quite a number of people have asked me, is where does the United States or Canada play out in Revelation? Well, let's cover it for a minute. Think about this. If I take a globe and I look at this part, I get Europe over here, and I come over to this western part, and I've got a big thing from Canada down to the United States, Mexico, South America, all the way down to Chile and Argentina. So let's go back and trace this Roman Empire, if you will, and its derivatives. Oh, where did the first people come in the southern part of the New World? They displaced the native populations for the most part, and they came from Spain and Portugal for the most part. But let's come north of there and we get into the United States and Canada. Where did those people come from? They came from Western Europe for the most part, England, France, Germany, and they settled in what we call North America. Now, let's think about this. So the empire just moved west. We are all part of what happens in Europe, if you will. We may think that we direct everything, but we don't. We follow along. If there's a war in Europe, we're involved. If there's no war in Europe, we're not involved. But if we follow along, if there's something that goes on in the Catholic Church, we're involved. If there's nothing going on at the present time, we're kind of oblivious. because we say, oh, we're Protestants. We're not really involved. No, we protested, but another item to consider when you're looking at Revelation, history, and how we interact, what happened in the Reformation. Martin Luther, where did he break from? Catholic Church. Zwingli, where did he break from? Catholic Church. Henry VIII, where did he break from? Oh, Catholic Church. But guess what? They all did. They all retained 90% or more of the Catholic faith. Nobody says, oh, I don't believe in going to heaven anymore as a reward, or I don't believe in going to hell. And even the second return of Jesus in a lot of cases, oh, we don't believe that because that's either old or something way, way in the future and doesn't apply to us. So think of your roots. Where did you come from? Now, if you came, and one young lady I have that attends my class came from Cambodia, so I can't apply those same things to her, if you will. But we take, for the most part, what is the majority of the population that comes into the Western Hemisphere. We're just an extension of the Roman Empire of its time, all the way down to today. We act like it, we do the same things, and we try to take and model ourselves after it. Why? Because we use Latin for our pharmaceuticals. We use Latin for our basis for our laws. Everything that we do has basically come down as some type of derivative of the Roman Empire. We do our laws, we do our courts, for the most part, based on Roman law, going all the way back to, pardon me, the false imprisonment of Jesus. And we have to look at, one of the other things we need to look at is, as we've looked at history, our interpretation of Revelation, has our past teachings restricted our thinking and understanding going into today? Has things changed from the 1800s, the 1700s, the 1900s to today? One example that keeps coming up, and people ask me, and I'm really not wanting to step on everybody's toes, but we need to take a hard look at some of the concepts that we have brought down with us from the roughly 1800s. Not just us, but other Christian sects, if you will, that publish data out there. We all use the same terms, if you will, right down to today as to what's going on. Or we're looking for the same items. But let's take the British Empire. The sun will never set on the British Empire. The sun not only set, it disappeared on the British Empire in 1947. The British Empire does not exist today. So we can't look at the British Empire as something that's going to take place in the last time. If we are, we're looking at a country, if you will, or 3 countries, 4 countries, of 67 million people. About 1/3 larger than the state of California in the United States. Not really big. And if we compare it to the state of California from a economic standpoint, the state of California pretty much dwarfs the British Empire, or the UK, excuse me. Sorry about the mix-up. So we have to look at these things in today's world, not yesterday's world, because Revelation gave us a changing concept going all the way through history right up till today. So what am I looking at? Am I still stuck in a past time, or am I looking to what the future is that I'm supposed to be cognizant of in my time as to what is going on, and should I be ready for hard times, or are we going to have a little peace in our time? One of the items that comes up that you need to study also is the time periods that people were living in. John's time period actually existed for the writing of Revelation only from about the year 95 to about 100. So it was only about a 5 or 6 year span of time. The second span of time then comes in from about there to about the year 280. And that's great expansion for Christ's teachings throughout the world, where by the year 280 about half of the Roman Empire were professing Christians at the time. Now, not the professing Christians that came to be in 325, but they represented a large chunk of the empire. And between them and the Jews proselytizing, they constituted a very big part of the empire from a human standpoint. But then in the year 280, all of these inroads by Christianity were put down by the various emperors that operated until Constantine came along. So each of these areas you have to kind of look at as part of your study. And when I do presentation 2, we'll get into that to show how each of the churches were affected by each of the time frames that they represent. And some very interesting study there. Some of the other things that you need to get into when you're looking at the empire, if you will, it's how the various countries broke up over the years, what they became. What happened to the Roman Empire in North Africa? Didn't exist after the 780s. Okay? The various breaking up of the parts of the Roman Empire took place over different periods of time. Different periods in the West, different periods in the East, punishments in the East, and the loss of total empire. We come down, we look at the empire, if you will, that died in 1453 at Constantinople when it passed to the Ottoman Turks. How long did they rule in the area? What happened to them? We have to look at all of these things. That means the Byzantine Empire we look at, the Holy Roman Empire we look at. We look at the British Empire, if you will. We look at the French Empire. How long did it last? The other big thing we need to look at, and is very appropriate today, is the French Revolution. 1789 to roughly 1799. 10 to 11 year time period. What happened during it? What fostered it? The same thing that we hear today on our television. Revolutionary teachings of the time. We need to do this. We need to do that. The government needs to take care of me. Same thing as today, only the names have changed to protect the guilty, if you will. So if you don't study the French Revolution, you don't know what's going on today. If you don't study the time period of Napoleon, you definitely will not understand certain parts of Revelation. He played a big part in it from about 1793. So he covers a period not only of about 16 years, but probably closer to 20 years, if you will. And all of these items that took place during the French Revolution, part of them were an offshoot of the American Revolution, except it was more bloody. Because after a certain period of time, The blood ran in the streets because of the introduction of a new, more efficient device to get rid of the political people of their time called Dr. Guillotine. And he had a very efficient means of separating people's bodies from their heads, if you will. As I've said, the barbarians are one thing we need to look at. And then there's another item that comes up in there that takes a little looking at, because we have another item called souls under the altar. Okay? If we don't study that a little bit, we'll never figure it out. What does it mean? Who are the souls under the altar? And we have different people speaking in different places in Revelation. Who are they? What are they trying to tell us? Did they apply to today? Did they apply during their time? Or did they apply totally throughout history? Let's take languages, another item. Today, where did our languages come from? And do we still have a problem with language today? I think we do, because I know when I worked in business that I worked with people in different countries, and I was always very thankful that they spoke very good English, because if they were dependent on me to learn German, French, and any other language, I was in deep trouble. So where do our languages come from? How do they influence us? How do they influence what's going on in Revelation and in history? Because they all tie into some aspect of where we are or how we believe. If I talk differently in the English language than relatives, spiritual relatives in Australia or New Zealand, are we really saying the same thing, but we use slightly different words to communicate those things? We don't know. Sometimes we have to dig into it, because what somebody may pronounce a word in English is not necessarily what I understand in North American English or in British English. They're separate languages in some respects. Okay? So if we're not going to take those items, if you will, and look deep into them, we've got a problem. And our problem is that we're not into study, we're just into reading. Okay, let me move on to a few other things. Revelation, if nothing else, is a very great learning experience for those who want to dig into it. If you went to school and you think math, English, science classes were hard, try to cover some of the material in Revelation. It has to be mastered and not just read. Not only do we have beasts, we have dragons, we have heads, we have horns. We have different kinds of horns. We have horns on altars, and we have horns on beasts. We have to look at, and I have written a whole page on this, false Christianity. And anybody who's got any information on it, you need to study it. Because you have the Roman Catholic Church that is basically based on idols and saints. We move to the East, and you have to study, what about icons? Are they the same thing? Oh, there's a whole split in those two churches over that particular item. The one does not recognize statues, the other one does not recognize icons. In effect, they're both the same thing. It's a picture or a statue. They both represent false saints or something else within the church of its time. Now we get down and let's take a look for a few minutes at horses. Because everybody always likes the four horsemen. Well, I have four horses But I also have 4 riders. So I have to look not at just the horse, I have to look at the rider. What is the color of the horse? What does the color mean? What is the rider? What is the rider doing? What is he carrying? What is he not carrying? All of these things enter into what is that particular rider doing during his stint, if you will, of operation, or his area of operation. You have to learn about some other things, and this is where it really starts to get complicated. Now I'm told about a furlong. Oh, how long is a furlong? Do I know? Am I into horse racing or anything else? Well, just to help you out, a furlong is about 1/10 of a mile, 1/10 of a Roman mile. Okay? Then you have to learn about a hand, because we've got some information in there about the height of horses. And so now you're going to become a horse expert, because now you have to know that a hand represents 4 inches in height. So what is now a standard horse? What is a big horse? What is a pony? You might want to know these things so you can be an expert in these areas. And then you've got things like wine presses of judgment. What is a wine press? What does it do? What happens to the effluent after you draw off the wine? What do you do with it? You might want to know, because it might be important if you're walking all over your yard and you've got this stuff because you tried to do something. The woes are of particular importance, if you will, and you have to really study the 4 woes, if you will. Oh, are those 4 or 3? Another item to look at. And then we get down to numbers. A couple of the problems with numbers are they have been translated from various languages into Greek and or Latin. Now, let's take anything coming out of Greece. Any large number that they could not define is called a myriad. It means large or big. Doesn't give you an exact number. If you're into Roman numerals, you can get some very large numbers, but they only go so high. Certain letters of the alphabet, if you will, represent certain amounts in numbers. So then you have to look at, what are we looking at as far as these numbers go? Where'd they come from? If I get a number that is too big, is it really that big? Or was it a translation of big, big? We don't know. We have small numbers. 1/2, 1/3. Oh, 1/3. How big is 1/3? Consider 1/3. If I'm talking about 1/3 of the Roman Empire, how big is that in territory? If I'm talking about 1/3 of the men, quote unquote, in the Roman Empire to be exterminated over a period of time, how big is that number? 1/3 may look small, or it may be very large. Then we have times such as 30 minutes. Or we have silence for 30 minutes. What does this mean? We have solar and lunar years brought in. Then we get to our favorite number, 144,000. It is the best known number probably in the Bible. Let's take a moment and look at 144,000, if we will. Where do we get the number from? Oh, we go to the chapter that has the 12 tribes of Israel. And we're going to get 12,000 from 12 different tribes in Israel. Let's see. If I counted up the 12 tribes of Israel that are given, I have a problem. I have a tribe called Joseph. The tribe of Joseph didn't exist. 2 half-tribes existed, half-tribe of Ephraim and a half-tribe of Manasseh. They existed. The tribe of Joseph never existed, but yet in Revelation, is this a mistranslation or is this a misdirection? Because we have the tribe of Joseph mentioned. We do not have one of his half-tribes mentioned. Oh, and we have the tribe of Dan that's not mentioned at all. Here's an area of study now we've got to look into, because we can't have 12 tribes if we are missing 1 or 2 or half of 1 and a whole 1. And we stuck in a whole 1 in place of a half 1. So there's an area of study. If you want to go and do some research, there's an area of research that will keep you busy for a long period of time to find out what happened. And if you really find out what happened, you can give me a call anytime and let me know so that I can add this to my research. Because I have ideas, but then I would give my whole thing away right now. So think about it. Things that we read about are not necessarily as we read them. Take it into consideration. We have things like 5 months and 5 months. Oh, okay. I know what 5 months are, but do I know what 5 months are prophetically in this particular context? Then I have the one that's a real puzzler. It's 1 hour, 1 day, 1 month, and 1 year. Oh, how long is that? And what time period did that cover in history, if any at all? I'll have to dig out the books, and believe me, I have enough timelines in my library that it drives me nuts trying to run down all of these dates, because I have to keep remembering that several times throughout the centuries people changed the calendar. So sometimes they fit very closely, but they don't necessarily mesh right in. But in some cases they fit very, very well. Actually, that time period represents a time period from about 1062 to 1453, just as an aside here. So we have all these dates in history, and everybody says, I hate history. I don't like those dates. I don't want to study dates. Well, if you don't want to study dates, I've got a solution for you. Do not bother, except in your daily reading when it comes around, to read the book of Revelation, because there are a lot of dates in there, referenced by inference, not necessarily at all times directly. So looking forward to a second installment of this, where I've just tried to lay some of the groundwork that we need to consider when we're looking at the book of Revelation. If we don't do the background information, it is very, very difficult to get into the specifics of the book or the chapter or a verse or a group of verses. My wife asked me the other day, what about this verse? I can't tell you about the verse because you need to consider the whole thing. What is the context? If I can't read a few verses before and get the full meaning, I can't understand that one verse. I can't pick it out and say this. It's like picking out a certain word within a verse and, oh, does this apply? I go back a number of years and the Watergate. Everybody says the Watergate, there's a Watergate in the Bible. Does it apply? No, it didn't apply. Just because a word is mentioned in the Bible does not mean it's relevant to any part of Revelation, or in some cases even history. It's just part of all of what man does during his lifetime. So what I'm trying to get across to everybody is, if you are going to study this book, you need to make a study of it. If not, I'm not saying don't read it. What I'm saying is, when you do read it carefully. Or, like I try to do, if you will, you take either your finger or a card and you read your Bible with it in place. Because what happens is, for most people, we want to read the Bible like a novel. It does not read like a novel. What it reads like is a change in thought or a change in direction. And sometimes this happens in the middle of a verse. If you are not following closely, you miss those changes. It's like taking a test for, if you will, the securities exam in the United States. You have to follow through because, oh, it just reversed itself. And then it reversed itself 5 words later, back to the original, and then 1 sentence later, it reversed it again. Which is the truth? If you're not following, you will miss it, and you'll miss it by a mile. So, when you're reading Revelation, you have to sit down and start with your finger and read word by word. Now, I know everybody says, Bill, nobody reads that way. I'm telling you, if you want to be effective in reading a lot of parts of the Bible, you need to read the words that are actually there. And sometimes you need to question them. You need to look at your Funkin' Wagnalls, if you will, your dictionary, and find out what that word means. It can be very effective. You have to know the words sometimes that are in the dictionary. They can make a big difference in your life and how they're used. Are we talking about cognizant facts or not? It makes a big difference. So if you want to do something, make sure you use the words in the right context from time to time. If you'll notice, a lot of our speakers, when they speak, they use words, and they use them very effectively because, guess what? They went to school. They did learn something. And they know how to get the message across to each and every one of us. Thank you.